American lectionary bids us read portions of the book of Job for the next several Sundays. And so it seemed wise to at least try to give a bit of an introduction to this very challenging book. You want to preach? Come, preach it, brother. Likely each of us at one time or another have had a Job-like experience where there has been some tragedy that has befallen us and where we have asked, where is God in the midst of all this? For me, such an event took place just yesterday. I had the privilege of leading a service of graduation for Tyndale. It was a bit of a different service of graduation. Normally we have, maybe somewhere between 75 to 100 graduates. Yesterday there was a graduating class of 1. Ordinarily we have it in the Tyndale Chapel that is absolutely magnificent. This time the graduation service took place in the party room of a condominium. Well, why would we have a graduation service for 1 in the party room of a condominium? It is because, in all likelihood, that graduate is not going to live to see the next service of official graduation in November. She may have perhaps 6-8 weeks to live. And so, although no one asked it, I'm sure it was in everybody's heart and mind as we gathered for this wondrous celebration of her graduation. But we all asked the question inwardly, where's God? In the midst of all this, someone who dedicated her life to study, a career in Christian counseling, where is God in the midst of all this? Well, if we read through the book of Job, it asks similar questions. At first reading, the book of Job, God does not come off well in the book of Job. It starts with this wager between God and Satan. And Job becomes the pawn in this heavenly chess match. And then in the first chapter of the book of Job, 10 of his children die. And in the last chapter of the book of Job, he is granted 10 more children, somehow as if children can be replaced. And in the midst of all this, we wonder. Well, let's take a look for a moment at the literature of the book of Job itself and ask the question sort of, who wrote it? Did Job write it after all of his adventures? Or did God write it to let Job know what was going on? Who wrote this book? And is it about a factual event or not? Well, scholars, as I read it, have come up with the conclusion that, first of all, nobody really knows who wrote the book of Job. And nobody really knows what the circumstances were of the writing of the book. But what they are pretty convinced about is that, in all likelihood, it is not based on one true story, but likely a compilation of many stories put together. Come on, get on there. And it is, in a way, more like one of Jesus' parables. You know, the parables of Jesus, they don't really have a set context. A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Nobody asked, well, who was it? What was his name? What was the name of the priest that came by? What was the name of the Levite? Who was the Samaritan? We don't ask those things. We just know that somewhere in the midst of all of this, there is truth. There is wisdom that is being given. In the same way, in the book of Job, it starts off in a rather open fashion that it says, well, there once was a man from Uz. Well, where's Uz? Nobody knows where Uz is. It's never anywhere mentioned in the Bible. So, in all likelihood, it is one of those universal stories that is set in an indistinct time and in an indistinct place. And yet, as we look at that story, it is absolutely timeless and has spoken to generation upon generation as each of us has looked at that story. And each of us has at one time asked the question that is raised in the book of Job that asks, what can we say about faith and about God in the midst of undeserved and unrelenting suffering? Where is God in the midst of all that? Or we might ask more simply, why do bad things happen to good people? Well, you see, we have these propositions, I think. Propositions that we would like to be able to believe. The propositions go something like this. We believe in a God that is absolutely all-powerful. Anything that happens, God's in charge, God caused it. And the second proposition we like to believe in is God is just. And God will bring to righteous people wonderful things. And God will bring to unrighteous people awful things. And the third proposition we want to believe is, since we are pretty good people, and Job was an extraordinarily good man, then nothing should ever happen to Job. Well, as long as everything is going well in life, we can believe all those three propositions really easily. But the problem is, what happens when things go wrong? We can't hold on to each of those propositions. So for Job, people would say, well, God is in control, God is just, bad things happen to Job, therefore, Job's a bad man. And that's what Job's friends in quotes, were saying to him, is, Job, if all this stuff is happening to you, it must be because you, Job, deserve it, and you're just in denial. Well, it may be wonderfully comforting to his friends, but it's not very comforting to Job. Or we can say, well, if Job is good and God brought suffering, then God's not a very nice God. And God isn't righteous. Or we can say, Job is good and God is just, suffering happened, then God's not in charge and there are things outside of God's control. It's really hard in those moments to be able to put all three of those propositions together. So then, does it mean God brings suffering? Let's wrestle with that one for a moment. Let's flash forward to the New Testament times, book of John, chapter 9, when disciples brought to Jesus a man who was born blind. Now, if he was born blind, it can't be punishment for something that he did, right? Because he was born that way. So what did the disciples do? They asked Jesus, so who sinned? the father or the mother, that it was visited upon this child, and this child was born blind. What was Jesus' answer? His answer was, hey, neither one of them, neither the father nor the mother sinned, but that in the midst of this suffering, God is going to be glorified. And he said this event is going to bring people into a closer relationship with God. So does God bring suffering? I have a yes and no answer to that. It goes something like this. Did God cause the Jewish officials at the time of Jesus to be jealous of him? Did God orchestrate it so that the religious officials would be so jealous that they would bring Jesus to Pilate? And did God put it in Pilate's heart to be so unforgiving and so blind that Pilate would hand him over to crucifixion? I say, no, I don't see God working like that. And yet, in the midst of the suffering and the death of Jesus, God was glorified, and good things came out of it. Well, lest we think that Job was perfect in the midst of all this, he did have some really good answers in chapters 1 and 2. In chapter 1, after all of his kids die, all of his flocks and herds and everything dies, Job has that wonderful word that says, naked I came into this world, naked I will go out. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And in chapter 2, again, challenged by all that has happened, what does Job say? He says, shall we expect from the hand of God only good? Or shall we expect at the hand of God some good and some not so good? Well, but much of that was just chapter 1 and 2. There are 30-something chapters. The rest of it, Job is not all that gleaming bright. Chapter 3, if you go on to chapter 3, he curses the day he was born. And says, God, I hate that day. I want you to never bless that day, that the sun will never shine on the day that I was born. Well, we have in the mouth of Job not only where he blesses God, but also the lament of Job. The lament that says, oh God, oh God, oh God. And you know what? Both are okay. In the scriptures, we have lots of lament. Look at the book of Psalms, where the psalmist will say, how long, O God, how long? It is a lament. And in both the praise and the lament of Job, we get the truth that says, you are God, I am not. And that is the truth of it all. Well, if I were to ask you, when do you find that your character is best shaped and that you more become who you truly can be? Is it in what we would call the days of sunshine? Or is it in the days of storm and cloud? Likely, the times when we really become who we believe ourselves to be, it's not in the days of sunshine. It is when we are tested and challenged, and it is in those dark days that our character really is formed. St. Paul knew this long ago. In Romans 5, he wrote, have patience in your sufferings, because know that suffering produces endurance. Endurance produces character. Character produces hope. And hope will not disappoint. So even in the midst of all this, God is saying that in suffering, there will be a release of the presence of God, even though it may be hard for us to see at the time. But yet, I'm not satisfied. I actually think we have the book of Job completely upside down and backwards. Because every time we look at the book of Job, what do we look at? We look at how does humanity continue to have faith in God in the midst of all of the suffering. I think we've got it upside down. I think what the book of Job is really talking about is the faith that God has in humanity. Picture it, if you will. We've all seen these movies where they have card games, and the pot is increasing, and two people are left, and they're both holding their cards. And one of them finally says, I am so confident in my hand, I'm all in. Everything I've got, I'm all in. I'm going to put it all down on this hand that I'm holding. That's what I see in the book of Job. I see God and the Satan sitting together at a poker table, and God saying, I've got a hand. And that hand is Job. And you know what? I have such faith, such trust in this hand that I'm all in. Everything I've got, I'm all in because I have that much confidence and faith in this guy Job that nothing's going to shake his faith. It's not about Job's faith in God. It's all about God's faith in Job. How does that change things? For me, it changes it absolutely dramatically. Because then I know that when I face trials, tribulations, sufferings of one kind or another, I know that there is a God that is saying, Paul, I have absolute faith in you. I have absolute confidence in you that we are together going to defeat Satan over all this. And Satan cannot win in this hand because I've got you in my hand. I have faith in you. As we face the challenges of life, may we know, absolutely know, that in the midst of it all, God has faith in us. Amen.